Today we're going to be looking at one of the tracks off of the new 1975 album. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Looking for Somebody to Love. This track was probably the hardest to remake out of all the tracks off the new album. I'm going to walk through how I replicated that sort of mid-range punch layer with all the horns and keys. We'll walk through some interesting layers in the drums and some fun sound design stuff for indie pop. But before we jump into any of that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a guitar-based pop producer. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to produce their own indie pop at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you watch this video and you enjoy it, and you think that maybe we could have some fun working on a track together, check out the top link in my description. All right, on to the video. Probably my favorite layer are the drums on this track just because they're very simple. But they have some very interesting layers going on. For the kick and the snare, we're just using some Leno samples from Splice. I listened to an episode of the podcast Tape Notes where Matt and George from the 1975 walked through the production process of this last album. And something George said that really stuck out to me that I've actually stated in previous videos is, for the kick drum here, we're not really going for something modern and clicky. We're going for something very vintage, almost hip-hop style. Like, there's a little bit of a gated reverb going on with it right now. But if you were to listen to a classic hip-hop record like Wu-Tang Clan or The Roots, this kick drum sound is not that far off from it. In terms of a snare drum, again, a Leno sample. This track has this very almost running vibe to it. Like, it has sort of a jazzercise feel, if that makes sense. And something that I noticed in the original snare is it almost has this cheesy 80s white noise effect to it. Because in the 80s, something that they would do to sort of beef up a sort of Bon Jovi style snare is they would add a little bit of white noise underneath it. And so I chose a sample that kind of had that vibe, leveled it out a bit with Mo-TT, and then running it through the same sort of gated reverb that everything else is running through really helped in bringing that feel of the drums together. And this kick and snare are pretty much the main part of the show. The next element are the hi-hats, which again are from the TS Elements pack with a little bit of transient shaping. We just wanted to get that sort of like running, like getting that sort of like almost train emotion, like that's really the feeling I wanted to get from the drums, to the point where I ended up doing some weird stuff like adding another set of hi-hats. Like, I didn't feel like I was getting it from just those hi-hats, so I used a slate kit, just using the hi-hats. Whenever I'm doing something weird like this, where I'm trying to get more of a live band feel, I'll actually leave the room mics up because that does affect how the hats sound. If I wasn't making this video, I'd probably just bounce this down as audio. But yeah, I did a bunch of transient shaping, compression, side changed it to the kick so it ducked out of the way. But then a layer that a lot of people I know who love this track haven't caught on is this guy. There's like a slight layer of brushes in the background. I think I was using this Slate Jazz Brushes kit and then just processing the crap out of it. Because again, I wasn't really trying to replicate the exact tone that I heard on the album. I was trying to replicate that sort of chugging motion that all the drums have together. So when I group all of these layers together with a little bit of compression, like, it gets that sort of jazzercise sort of jumping motion going. And if I take out these two slate drums, like, it doesn't have the same energy. It almost has this annoying, like, texture to it. But since this is more of like a lo-fi indie pop track, that actually kind of makes it stand out a bit more in the mix. And since the drums are so simple, it allows the bass to actually go a bit crazier with it. I believe I just used my P-Bass for this. Nothing crazy, just a little bit of a gate to get rid of any noise when I'm not playing. Going into an Ampeg SVT Pro from Plugin Alliance, and some tone shaping with CLA bass. But what I love about the performance on this bass is that it's very intentional about moving around the drums, but still sort of hitting the chord changes that it needs to hit. So like, it starts by playing the chord on the downbeat. In the middle of all of this sort of noodling, it's making sure that it's hitting the chords on the changes. And I feel like this is something that a lot of people miss when they're writing groovy bass lines, is that all this sort of like riffing or jamming that the bass seems to be doing, it's never just random. It's done as a transition between sections. Like, normally what I would do when I'm writing a bass line for this is I will just hit all of the chord changes that I know I need to hit, and then I'll have another track going just below it that's That's the exact same signal chain. And on that separate track, I will actually write the other part of the bass line where I come up with creative transitions between these different sections. And that way you're able to compose something that sort of feels like it's moving somewhere. Like the end of that, like that's not just a little bit of a riff that they made. It's made so that it lands on that next chord change. And then the last part that I would say is important to the intro is this synth sound. Like right here, just playing these few elements. That is the intro, essentially. For this, I found sort of an older modular style synth because I know that George from the 1975 is a fan of these. And I just found a patch that had that sort of crunchiness to it. It almost sounds like a Nintendo. And I turned on a couple of one knob pumpers to get that motion going. The Lindell channel strip to shape it a little bit. Did some EQ. Just to sort of narrow in on that frequency that I wanted it to hit, and then leveled it out with some OTT. And that's how I got that sound. Through the entire track and in the intro, we do have this pad going, which is just Pantheon from Arcade, which just gives it a little bit of a space. I felt like there needed to be almost like a chorusy Juno style pad, but this was the fastest thing that I could find that had that sort of air to it, but didn't have like an overly scooped mid-range. Also in the intro, you have these interesting layers, like this percussion, which is almost like a Foley shot. And then we have these guys, and then we have these tom hits as a transition, which mixed with the rest of the impact stuff that's happening on the downbeat really gives it that sort of like 80s feel. 1975 is also a fan of really heavily tuned vocal shots, so we have a couple of these guys here. It feels so fun. Like it almost feels like you're running down a mall in the 80s at midnight. And after all of that, we have to now start talking about this massive hit that took forever to make. And honestly, on some level, if you're trying to replicate this sound, pay more attention to the thought process behind how I got to this point instead of actually trying to replicate this patch for patch. So if I play it all together, breaks down into 3 main sections. It's basically the exact same line being played in multiple different sections. So first we have the synths, which is a mixture of a DX7. We have a CZ, a couple other CZ patches. And the thought process behind the synth layer was we wanted this to be the thing that sort of adds the sparkle on top of it. Also a little bit of that cheesy 80s flavor, which if you're trying to get that sound using something like a CZ synth, which I think is based off of the CZ1, it's just sort of that perfect nostalgic 80s sound. And then all of them are grouped together and bus processed. Had to scoop the mids a bit because they were getting kind of heavy. And then my biggest bane, the horn section. And the reason why I say that is because my personal preference for a production is to have live horns. Because horns are one of those things where I don't feel like modern production software has gotten to the point where a experienced horn player can be replicated perfectly, which is probably why they used live horn players on this album. But essentially we have the exact same MIDI being played in a bunch of different contact instruments that are focused on different ranges. Less of like ranges of the instrument in terms of octaves, but more so ranges of the frequency spectrum. So those are some really bright trumpets. Then we have those same trumpets an octave down. To get even more trumpetiness, we're using the default contact library. Exact same an octave down. We have this sort of muted trumpet. More so because I wanted that texture in there. So altogether, we did some mid scooping. And then here we have the guitar layers. We have a clean electric, just using archetype Corey Wong. And I really wanted the guitars to be sort of the main layer that added that sheen. So underneath that, we have another guitar playing pretty much the same thing, but on a really distorted patch. almost to get some of that like DS1 distortion tone that they had on the first album. And then I wanted to have it jump out even more on the guitar layer. So I actually recorded acoustic, plugging my acoustic into my DI, which is never how I record acoustics, but I really wanted that. That sort of like live chorus 80s arena acoustic, which sounded really cool. So all those together. And it just kind of added a vibe to it all. And all of those layers blended together sound like this. And then to try to emulate how they differentiate that A and B section, I tried adding a little bit of a horn solo. One trick that I would give that I used a lot in this track, because again, this is sort of a standard contact instrument. In fact, if I turn off all the processing, it just sounds like this. So I wanted it to be more of a mono instrument. So I made it mono, used some OTT. But the reason I ended up using Saturn on it is because the main difference that you get with a horn player who's like really pushing something dynamically, like to the point where they're almost distorting it, all that's doing is it's adding more natural harmonics. And so a way that you can sort of replicate that, if your horn players are playing something a little bit softer, is literally add harmonics using distortion. So I used FabFilter Saturn here, split these bands just so I could turn off this one and only affect everything that looks like above 170. So you can sort of replicate that feeling of intensity and a little bit of RC20 and H delay. Make it sound kind of old and weird. And then underneath all of that, which is the last thing we have to look at, are these layers. So again, clap impact on the one. We have some decap loops. Normally used as like a way to sort of replicate the weirdness that they have in their productions. So this is what it sounded like before. And I just used a bit crusher, some kilohertz, and then an auto pan to sort of make it go from side to side, just so it's not taking up too much space. We then have this guy, sort of filling in spots sparsely in between everything. Another percussion loop. Band passed it because I didn't really want the low end from it or the high end from it. I just sort of wanted these like mid-range pokey things to come out at you. And then one more. And then this guy here at the bottom, which I use as sort of like a tail end transition. But if we listen to all of these guys together, it really adds that sort of weirdness that's in a lot of 1975 tracks. And of course, we're side chaining them to the kick and the snare so that they're filling in all of this space when nothing else is happening, but then they're ducking out of the way when something is happening. So yeah, I think that's everything. And let's just listen to what the final track sounds like. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you've watched this far, thank you. I've done a lot of videos like this, so please consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon and all that stuff. Also, if you have any other ideas for indie pop style beats that you would like me to recreate and take a look at from a production level, put them down in the comments, because that's genuinely how I find a lot of newer songs. Over here are some videos that YouTube thinks that you would enjoy watching from me. But yeah, I will see you guys next Friday.